It's weird to say that a spin-off with such a different genre of gameplay is one-upping its bigger siblings, when it shares very little in common with them other than its setting. But when I say Tales outshines the other Borderlands games, I'm not really talking about gameplay here. What I mean is, Tales from the Borderlands develops and conveys themes that other games in the series have been struggling to do for their entire run. Namely, the idea that Borderlands is a universe where everything has become hyper-commodified. Private space colonization led to complete corporate control over countless planets, to the point where you could kinda call the Borderlands universe post-government. Even life has become commodified, with the in-game explanation for you respawning being digital cloning booths that charge a tax to resurrect you. Though to be fair, those might not really be canon. But the point being that the series is an attempt at critiquing an anarcho-capitalist paradise similar to BioShock making fun of Ayn Rand. The major difference being that Borderlands has always been, first and foremost, a comedy. And when I say comedy, I mean a boiling pot filled with pop culture references, toilet humor, and people doing wacky, violent things with a glib delivery. Each entry has a slightly different ratio as the series has evolved, but overall, the series has a reputation for being one of those media pieces you either find funny or annoying. A lot of people may know this already, but originally, instead of being a satirical cyberpunk game with Mad Max influences, Borderlands 1 was going to be a gritty Mad Max game with cyberpunk influences.
Why have you come here? Only fools and criminals come to this planet. This is a dangerous place. If the bandits don't get you, the wildlife will. You won't last long here. Not without help. Not without guns. A hell of a lot of guns. Why have you come here? You're looking for the vault, aren't you? You won't find it. I'll tell you the same thing I told all those who came before you. It doesn't exist.
No cell shading. And while I don't know what the writing was going to be, I feel like the toned-down nature of Borderlands 1 compared to later sequels suggests that this was going to be much more of a serious franchise. I think why this change of lanes wasn't that crazy of a move, even for the devs, is that Borderlands seems to have been first and foremost a proof of concept piece for its gameplay. I really don't think Gearbox expected it to blow up like it did, and at first it kinda didn't anyway. A bunch of game creators went, hey, Diablo blew the world away because of its randomly generated loot. What's a way we can bring that into a modern game, but with more speed? And the answer they came up with was the looter shooter. Drop-in, drop-out co-op, RPG skill trees that allowed for a couple different builds per character, and most importantly, an enormous gun randomization system that was beyond anything anyone had seen in an FPS like this. Systems similar had been tried before, sure, and occasionally there had been some success, but never had it been paired with a game that had such mainstream appeal and such ease of access for multiplayer. What Mario Kart was for racing games, Borderlands was for FPS games. In Borderlands 1, the devs expected players to just sit there and listen to NPCs with jokes peppered throughout the dialogue to garner a few laughs with your friends. Whereas Borderlands 2 started to change the dialogue formula. Now quest prompts were mostly all joke. NPCs shouted constantly and sarcastically bickered. Everything was designed so that the loud quips the game made would occasionally cut through the conversation you'd be having in real life with whoever you were playing with. The devs knew you'd only actually absorb what characters were saying during single-player runs, and the vast majority of co-op players would talk over the dialogue in favor of discussing their loot, or what quest to do next, or making jokes, or messing around, or whatever you do. I'm not saying this is a bad thing at all. In fact, it really works. All the most crucial plot information in Borderlands 2 is conveyed either during cutscenes, yelling, or with set pieces, which use their visuals to grab your group's attention. This weird concoction allows you to actually understand the gist of what's going on without actually having to pay any attention. But it also pulls the franchise further into the multiplayer realm, and in doing so makes it much more juicy prey for nasty monetization practices. Which means you end up with a Borderlands that's outwardly a corporate satire game, but inwardly embraces everything it pokes fun at, which isn't helped by the writing not usually getting all that deep, even when focusing on it in the single player, because it has to maintain that immature, jokey reputation to keep the multiplayer light and aloof. So when Telltale announced that they were making a Borderlands game, it was kind of a confusing announcement. I really get why so few people were interested in it, and why it's one of the worst-selling Telltale games out there, because on its face, it's kind of a baffling combo. I mean, sure, Telltale got more action-y later on, but at the time, the only games most gamers knew Telltale for was Walking Dead 1 through 2, Wolf Among Us, Poker Night, and maybe their older point-and-click adventure games. All these games barely have any fighting in them. Almost all these games are slow emotional dramas, and with the exception of Sam & Max and Poker Night, they're all fairly serious. They were known for taking properties and sort of dramatizing them, with a little neo-noir flair or mystery or some other spice. They were at their heart choose-your-own-adventure books, but with modern properties and digital graphics, and sometimes a lot of crying. So how do you take that style and make a Borderlands game out of it? Borderlands is all fighting, it's all jokes. It's in every way the exact opposite of Telltale's reputation. A reputation that had become extremely well known with the outstanding success of The Walking Dead. And clearly Telltale had the same doubts because, unlike most of their early titles, from what I've read, it had a rocky development, as it was continually slated for cancellation between almost every episode released. In a way, it was a known failure from the start. I remember seeing articles at the time talking about how Telltale had lost so much interest in the project that work on Tales was being done voluntarily, and thus in a way it was made with a lot more freedom and less studio interference than other games from the developer. And while now I am not sure how true that is, it would explain how much more ambitious Tales from the Borderlands is when compared to Telltale's other titles, with creative decisions I am sure Telltale would never normally okay. Because they did it! They made a Borderlands game without much fighting, a Borderlands game with some actually deep and interesting writing, but most of all, they made a Borderlands game with real, serious, emotional moments, and yet somehow didn't sacrifice the goofy setting. I'm not saying it holds a candle to the end of Walking Dead Season 1, but I guarantee you a lot of players got teary-eyed at least once during Tales from the Borderlands. I am not saying it holds a candle to the end of Walking Dead Season 1, but I guarantee you more players than you think got teary-eyed during Tales from the Borderlands. And they pulled it off by doubling down on this being a character story. Previous Telltale games were definitely character-oriented, but they were always beholden to some kind of overarching plot, usually a mystery or a journey to get to a boat. Tales, though, purposefully swings straight away from plot importance. Yeah, there is a vault full of treasure that every Borderlands game points towards and ultimately ends on, but pretty much all the characters in the game either imply or admit the vault is just a way to give direction to their life. It's something to push them forward, but in reality, a goal most don't expect to actually reach. In a way, the whole game is a crucible for the cast to test themselves against and become better people by overcoming their various faults. It's a superhero origin story. And while Lee and Clementine from Walking Dead are definitely presented that way, the rest of the cast really isn't. With Tales, it's everyone. Every single character that gets repeated screen time either evolves or devolves, many times depending on your choices. I think that's why, and I don't know if this is going to be considered a bad take, but Tales from the Borderlands is the only Telltale game where I remember every side character. Like, every single one. And this is the first time I played the game since it came out in 2014, 2015. I've only played this twice, and it's been 8 years. And I've played Walking Dead and Wolf Among Us at least twice, and definitely more recently. There's no reason for me to remember this cast so vividly. There's no reason for me to feel emotional investment in these characters I've really only seen once. And I'll get to the cameos in 3. Really, I should like Wolf Among Us the best. I honestly thought I did. Wolf Among Us has my favorite style of music, the kind of visuals I'm usually obsessed with, and really deep characters. But then I replayed Tales from the Borderlands, and all these feelings came rushing back. I remember being blown away, delayed episode release after delayed episode release, thinking that the last one must have been a fluke. Almost no one else was into this game. It had to go downhill from here. It was the beginning of the end of Telltale's career. And playing every episode back to back now, all these years later, I think I love this game. Replaying Tales in its complete form, it's almost impossible to see how it didn't blow up and become the biggest hit if you were unfamiliar with the context of its release. But let's stop talking about my weird cathartic journey only I care about and get down to some mechanics, because this game shines there too. Right off the bat, when you bring up a Telltale-esque game, the first question you'll be asked is if your choices really matter. And because we don't live in a world where you have a VR jack to full dive interface into the Matrixverse yet, the technical answer when asked about that for any video game is no. Your choices really don't matter, apart from maybe a different predetermined ending. But obviously that's not what people really mean when they ask that question. What I think people really mean is, can this game trick me into thinking that my time with it was personal and unique? Do I feel like this experience ended in a way where I was personally responsible for the outcome? And that's a much harder question to answer, because I think different people vibe better or worse with a game depending on how the devs want to tell their story. Example being, for me personally to feel that what I did matters, a game usually needs to have a strong atmosphere, or a deeply developed setting. I felt that way about Cyberpunk 2077 when a lot of people didn't, and I will freely admit that a lot of that comes from my bias towards immersing myself in that kind of layered and textured world. It's not that one way is correct or wrong, it's that certain styles hit certain people differently, I think. I would bet most of you watching this don't know that Borderlands does not take place in the Milky Way galaxy, and that's because it's irrelevant, only mentioned a few times, and ultimately just not the point. I mention this to try to point out that Borderlands has never really targeted the biases I've developed, which makes me feel safer saying that Tales from the Borderlands nails the illusion of choice in a way that seems more universal to me. And I think that comes from the emphasis on side characters. It's not like The Walking Dead, where you were just deciding which of two people will live and hoping the one you chose will have the skills needed for some later crisis. It's much more relationship-based. Characters aren't going to die off necessarily, though this can still happen. It's more like they trust you less, or they find out a secret you didn't reveal at a bad time instead of telling them earlier, or other stuff along those lines, not to get too spoilery. And when those relationships aren't properly built up by you, it makes later dangerous situations that much harder, or even removes potential options. Instead, you're constantly trying to gauge every character's ability and willingness to execute on the current plan. Not only because the majority of your gang are inexperienced D-listers when compared to the confident vault hunters you normally play as in Borderlands games, but also because the main cast has no real cohesion, and all it would take is a better option and your bad choice to make an ally have second thoughts about you. Sure, this doesn't happen nearly as much as I wish, but Tales does it more than enough for the threat to be real, and in both directions too. I can't quite prove it, but I'm pretty sure there are times when a character liking you too much might actually be a detriment. And I'm not talking about Jack. The problem is, I keep talking about this like there's a reputation system where side characters have an opinion of the player, which is super wrong, because Tales is one of those few games where you play as two entirely separate characters, with different and often opposing goals, and with entirely separate reputations when it comes to the opinions of other characters. Sure, many Telltale-type games have had multiple characters you switch between, but here it's straight up an attempt at having equally weighted dual protagonists. But that's also one of the biggest flaws with Tales from the Borderlands. Well, I say one of the biggest flaws, really the biggest flaw, is the terrible engine Telltale stuck with, which causes all these awful, janky animations that were bad even 7 years ago. I don't think I really need to talk about that, though, since it was such a noticeable issue with every single Telltale game, that it's commonly cited by fans as one of the biggest reasons for their bankruptcy. Besides that, though, the biggest hole in Tales from the Borderlands' design comes from the uneven weight they give to each character. Both protagonists, Rhys and Fiona, each get unique mechanics that only they can use when controlling one or the other. Rhys, the first protag you meet, has an Echo Eye implant, which not only lets you hack plot objects, but allows you to check his company's database for info on pretty much everything. The problem is that Fiona's mechanical counterpart to Rhys's Echo Eye kinda sucks, and isn't useful prior to the very end of the game. Really, her ability to collect money is just used for cosmetics designed to trick you into wasting your cash, and one plot thing. Fiona does get a second unique mechanic, and that's her Derringer pistol, a gun you only get one bullet for. Except, and more spoilers here, but it's a 7-year-old game no one played. Halfway through the game, you get infinite bullets for it. So basically, Fiona gets one mechanic that's only useful at the end of the game and is designed to trick you into wasting it beforehand, and one mechanic that's only useful at the start of the game and is designed to trick you into saving it until it's wasted. Meaning, I think most players never got to properly use Fiona's only two unique mechanics, while constantly getting to use Rhys's Echo Eye the entire time. Even though I think Fiona gets more conversations and ultimately is a more interesting character to pick dialogue for, this ends up meaning that Rhys is just loads more fun to play as, because in second-to-second gameplay, he has more options and utility and more going on in general. Fiona is billed personality-wise as this sarcastic, self-sufficient con artist who is constantly disappointed in Rhys's inability to cope with the Mad Max world of Pandora, probably because she's bitter that Rhys takes his better lot in life for granted, especially at the start of the game. And that works during conversations, but as you get through more and more gameplay puzzles, with Rhys essentially doing maybe 75% of the work every time by hacking into everything, it becomes more and more confusing for Fiona and her sister Sasha to constantly remark how useless Rhys is when they both contribute very little outside of dialogue sequences. I don't think this is intentional either. Fiona's flaw very clearly seems to be her lack of self-confidence in her ability to be anything beyond the desperate life she was born into. Her flaw, I'm pretty sure, is not supposed to be just denying people's contributions because they make her feel useless. If anything, that's supposed to be Rhys's big flaw. And it's very confusing, especially when her dialogue options have way more choices involving praising a friend's skills compared to Rhys's, whose dialogue options are filled with petty attempts to protect his own pride. A system where Fiona could use her Pandora knowledge to give info on stuff like the Echo Eye, or maybe a system where she could bribe people with money, or having more options for her to use the pistol with rubber bullets maybe for puzzles, all would have really balanced the game out. And what really would be great is if during certain dramatic dialogue moments, you had the choice of whether to control Rhys or Fiona, instead of the narrative forcing which one you're going to be at any given moment. Having to weigh your options and use past dialogue choices to kind of suss out how each character might try to deal with the situation on their own. Maybe you might be stuck between picking the protag you know has the skills and tools to solve the problem, versus picking the protag you think might make bad moves on their own and trying to do damage control. This would allow for so many fakeouts where maybe you think Reese will be able to hack something, so you pick him, only for the computer's ice to beat your Echo Eye and take Reese out for a while. Or maybe you think Fiona could talk a character down, but the guy doesn't respond well. So the better move was actually to have Reese fumble through some kind of threat about Hyperion sending down moonshots or something if they don't comply. As it stands now, you're always playing as the correct protagonist for the situation, and unfortunately that's usually Reese. That being said, if you haven't played the game and this is sounding like a deal breaker to you, I don't mean it the way I think you're thinking I do. This is stuff I noticed much more on my second playthrough because it's covered up by Fiona seeming to get most of the screen time overall. Yeah, Reese starts the game and gets the Handsome Jack interactions, but not only does he kinda drop off to side character levels of involvement once his character arc ends, but he seems to get the least conversation time too. Fiona is the face of the party in D&D terms. She sunk all her points into Persuade and Bluff, and the gang typically pushes her into being the greeter for any new allies or enemies. The side characters all look to her to make decisions, and if it wasn't any more clear that she's written to be the main protagonist of the two, Fiona is the one who wants to be a Vault Hunter, the thing all Borderlands protagonists are. And maybe that's why they gave Reese so many more utility options, to balance that out, but it just doesn't work. It makes it feel more like you control one person who gets all the narrative stuff, and one person who actually does all the mechanical stuff. These are the kinds of mistakes you would make in a first game, eventually tuning and fixing it in a sequel. Except that's not gonna happen because not only is Telltale dead, not only did no one really play this game, but I think Gearbox kinda hates the story and characters told here. Or more accurately, I think Randy Pitchford hates them for some reason. Though I have no direct evidence for that. A lot of people say Reese and Vaughn, the only two characters from Tales to cameo in a mainline Borderlands game, were written really badly, but I kinda disagree. Take Vaughn, for instance. In Tales, he's this nervous accountant who is constantly terrified of being left behind by his much more confident friends. In Borderlands 3, that just gets boiled down to every line of dialogue he says, revolving around him being buff.
Pandora's in trouble. I can feel it in my bones. Or maybe that's just the harsh desert wind in my bare sun-dappled chest.
Okay, same page. You know what this calls for? Apology push-ups.
You know what? We're gonna stick it to those wannabe gods and make our own idols. In my image. Yeah, good idea. From chiseled jaw to legendary calves.
Tyrene Calypso put a bounty on my sculpted ass. And the rest of me, too. My clan only accepted me as a leader after I killed a guy with just my abs. So imagine what it takes to unite all the clans together. You'd need like a 20-pack. 18 bare mins.
Referencing a running joke in Tales that he has a lot of muscles for being an accountant. I've heard of some pretty crazy flanderization before, but I've never heard of a character becoming one joke after one sequel. And it's not the kind of mistake you make through incompetence, laziness, lack of skill. In fact, I'm not sure it's something you can even do by mistake. Because to even get to the built nerd joke requires playing through hours of content with Vaughn. Making someone say the same joke over and over is the kind of thing you do to make fun of a character you don't like. And it's similar for Reese. They took the joke that he bumbles through situations and make that all he does. There's no way this is by accident. No characters from Borderlands 2 get this kind of treatment in 3. The style of character writing only happens for the two characters from Tales from the Borderlands. And I haven't even talked about the fact that Fiona is just completely absent from the game. In a way, it suggests to me, and this is just personal speculation, based only on the numerous scandals and dramas that Randy Pitchford has been at the center of, that maybe they were kinda, I don't know, perhaps a little jealous of Tales from the Borderlands. Because Tales kinda took their world and gave it depth the mainline games never really could. It took the company's most famous villain, one of the most famous modern villains, and explored how much of a pathetic, nonsensical loser Handsome Jack really was. Tales from the Borderlands took the aspects that were most lacking, the things I've been hearing fans asking for a decade now, and nailed it with such creative precision that my understanding of the Borderlands setting is tied to Tales maybe more so than any other entry in the series. In no other Borderlands game have I ever gotten the sense of what it's actually like to live in this universe, or even the sense that it was realistically possible to live in it at all, without being some sort of loot goblin who shoots first and asks no questions. By being a narrative-focused spin-off, Tales had the freedom to flesh out the lives of the average person living on Pandora or working for Hyperion. But unfortunately, Telltale didn't see the potential in it, so they snubbed its development. Gamers didn't see the point of it, so they didn't give it a chance. And its own grandparent, Gearbox Software, decided its very existence was so pathetic that the only reason to reference it again was to ridicule it. I'm trying to say that there's a lot more value to spin-offs than most people seem to think. Changing the gameplay genre of a setting can make a fictional world seem more real than it ever could by itself. It's why Star Wars was so popular and now seems so hollow to a lot of people. The old expanded universe was an opportunity to see that galaxy from a million different perspectives and angles. And the lack of that variety of content under Disney has made it so much harder to actually picture real people living in the Star Wars galaxy. So, if you've never touched Tales from the Borderlands before, at least give it a chance, because I promise you statistically, there's a lot of people who are really mad they never tried the game sooner, and just don't know it yet.